Hi, Kat here for Lightwave Digital. In this video, we're going to be going over a quick rundown on how this shot is put together and how the properties are all working together with the various elements to generate a rocket ship lifting off or something similar. It could be a missile, it could be a starship or something, whatever it might be. The principles are something that you can adapt to your own shots. Let's take a look at what's behind this shot specifically. By changing our camera view, go to the perspective so that we can see everything that's involved. As you can see, we've got a simple flat ground plane. We have our rocket, which is a Hammond SAM or surface air missile rocket that was used for another show that I was working on a little while ago. We've got a simple straight key light. We have our turbulence FD container volume. We have our particle emitter, which is going to be emitting particles and generating temperature and density channel information in the volume. And this ground plane is working as a dynamics object to interfere with the particles so they kind of bounce around a little bit. That's why it's named bounce. So let's talk a little bit about these particles first and the bounce object that's working with them. Take a look at the emitter. Just press P for properties to bring up the object properties and go to the effects tab and we can see what's going on with the effects emitter. We have this being driven by an envelope that essentially goes from 0 all the way up to 2000 and continues to run through the rest of the shot. And it's generating particles based off of second. And we've got the nozzle being a sphere. This could also be a box in some cases. So this is generally best to be left as a sphere. We don't have a size effect or any change on here. Normal by default, this is speed, density fixed, mass change. In this particular case, it just went size, no change, it worked fine. And the generator itself is sized to be just at the very tip and roughly in line with the rocket engine nozzle. We've got a particle limit of 100,000 particles on here, or actually 1 million. That gives us enough particles to run through 250 frames of animation without any challenge worrying about particles or anything of the sort. They have a lifetime set to them so that they're not always on. They only last 10 frames. Depending on what you're doing in your shot, if you're going to construct something, this can be set much lower or much longer, and you can give a variance in here of plus or minus to vary their lifespan. But really, there's not much else in here with the exception of the motion values. We've got them going down at 10 meters per second, and there's a little bit of explosion variance on it with a vibration, 2 meters and 2 meters. So it's just shifting them around a little bit and getting them to spread out as the rocket travels. We've got gravity obviously on it and apparent motion set so that it's working with 25% of the parent motion. So it's going to kind of drag behind it a little bit, but not so much that it looks like it's just one continuous stream. It's got some mind of its own. That's working with gravity. We don't have any rotation information on here. It's not necessary for this. Interaction is not necessary. And don't need to worry about edit effects. Now, this particle generator is working in conjunction with this ground plane, which has an effects collision value set to it. It's got a little bit of radius, which is what this yellow bounding box is representing. It's got a bind bounce power of 150%. This basically tells the item that's going to bounce off of this that you need to have this kind of return or amount of bounce. Friction power is just a little bit, so there's a little bit of stickiness, as well as the fixed power. This basically allows for a particle to stay or stick to a surface and how long it takes for it to travel across that surface before it does stop. then there's the roughness, which determines how intense that is. Basically, this is a kind of a multiplier of these two numbers. Probability is set to 200% because I wanted to make sure that this was interfering as much as possible, so that these particles were bouncing up and giving us kind of like platform debris or some of that nature. And also I wanted to get some more fluid volume information up towards the rocket, because the rocket itself is also a collision object. So when it flies out of this, there's a little bit of drag on the volume fluid as it travels. Not much, but just enough to give it a little extra flavor. Let's take a look at the emitters. 3 emitters in here, nothing scary. We've got the rocket and the ground emitter and the actual body, which is just a collision object. The rocket engine emitter is really the place where all the magic happens. Radius for this, for each particle, is about 2.5 centimeters, and it's going to have a particle property of mass. This should really be set to size, but it really doesn't matter here. We've got particle variation, 25%, and just a straight linear 0 to 1 F curve on this. Let's take a look at the texture. Nothing really crazy in here. In fact, there's no values that are really being present other than just generate all 100% white, and that's the surface of the particle. If these things had like a small radius to it of 2.5 centimeters or 3.5 centimeters, they would all just be continuously emitting. Nothing would be changing off of their surface. A little bit of force though. Got velocity weight of 1. That's what gives the particle the ability to push and drag behind it fluid once it travels through. Normal force just kicks off a little bit of extra propulsion there, and we've got pressure that gives us the spread effectively when these particles are traveling. Temperature is 3 and 5. These could probably be set a little bit lower in practice, but it depends on the shot. These are pretty much set for set, so it's a continuous value, and the add is an add on top of density value as the particles are generating fluid. They're going to add to that amount. Let's take a look at the ground plane. This is just in here because I wanted to see what it was going to do, but ultimately the container itself is acting as a ground plane because I have the container volume set in the container parameters to close the negative y boundary, which is the ground. So it's acting as that as well. I could pretty much eliminate this and get the same result. There's really not much going on in here. There's a little bit of pressure to help break stuff up, but ultimately, because most of this is achieved from the particle system moving around, which is why I wanted it to bounce around a little bit and have a little bit more life, it really didn't need to have much done to it to get us what we want to go. And there's obviously no emission of any of the channels coming from this object. Let's go to the rocket. It's set for a collision object and there's nothing else to it. Has no pressure or force on it. It's just there to drag fluid if it interferes with it and occlude fluid and block it from occupying the space that the rocket occupies. Now, this object is subdivided, and in order to make sure that the calculation speeds were not excessive, I like to ensure that either I'm using a frozen object and replace it, or if necessary, use only the display subpatch level of 0, because that's what Turbulence FD is going to register as the collision object when it goes and calculates the simulation. Otherwise, when you start doing subdivision levels above 0, it's going to start to really impact how TFD is going to be able to simulate that, because it's looking at a much higher polygonal object, and in some cases TFD has difficulties trying to evaluate that based off of the subpatch type. So if you've got true sub Ds, you've got Captain Clarks, it can go one way or the other. Now, once you've done a sim, of course, you can turn this back up. So we can turn it back up to 3 if necessary. It's really not for this, so we'll just leave it at 0. Let's talk about some of the container parameters now. The container is actually quite large, because of the size or the distance that we have to travel, and we're trying to keep as much of the smoke within the boundaries. And if you're looking to generate this on your GPU, you need to kind of pay attention to this number up here. This GPU has 16 gigs of VRAM on board, and based off of these voxel settings and the height of this container, it's going to use about 14 gigabytes of that. I could probably push this a little bit more to like 2.8 maybe. Well, that's a little bit further past, maybe 2.9, and try to squeeze it into that maximum amount of GPU space that I have. This would be a little pushing in terms of how long it would take. So 3 was fine, and it worked just fine. Ideally, what I'd like to do is probably increase this voxel value and then increase the container out a little bit more to the edges, just to make sure that I'm not cutting anything off when the rocket takes off with the base plume there. As you can see, it's getting cut off a little bit. I'd rather increase the voxel size and get that in there, depending on what our camera is doing, of course. If we don't see it because we're off camera, then we don't need to really worry about it. So always factor that in when you go and build a shot like this. Of course, if your camera angle changes based on the request of a director or a supervisor, then you're going to have to reevaluate a few things. So always try to get that stuff locked down first. And that's the benefit of doing previs before committing to things like computational fluid dynamics, hard body dynamics, other physics simulations, because they are time consuming, and a change of the camera angle, if you've done your simulations with only that camera angle in mind, you can get yourself into trouble really, really quickly. But if you do, this would be where you'd have to make those changes and just kind of suck it up to either do the computations, or hopefully that camera angle change or the motion in some other way can get you to do the same thing, but give you some afforded budget somewhere else in the shot so that you're not really pushing everything to your absolute maximum limits. If necessary, you can always go back to your regular processor and calculate this out. So you want to do a higher resolution simulation, you can do it this way, and your processor should be able to take it for as much RAM as you physically have on board without running into too much trouble. It will take a while though. Let's take a look at the simulation tab. The solver is basically set up, as I said before, to do a closed wide boundary, so it acts as the ground plane. Collision objects are going to enlarge the container. Just means that if something goes outside of the boundaries of this collision object, it's going to expand it to accommodate it. We've got 2 step frame limit, just to give a little bit more information, because these particles are traveling at high speed, and we don't want them to look like they're steppy. And we've got a pressure duration limit. There's a significant amount of pressure on the rocket engine emitter. This just helps as well to make sure that there's no stepping in between frames, and helps evaluate things more accurately based off of the settings. If you have a higher pressure or very fast moving object, this is where you're going to have to compensate for it. Uprising we don't need, we're not worried about that here. Timing, just standard default. Velocity, again, standard default. We do have a little bit of window, just helps things out a little bit for animation of the material on the ground. Vorticity, we do have a vorticity input here. It's using the density channel, and our mapping curve is not the default. Normally the default is something like this. I've changed it to pull it back a little bit so it becomes a little bit more intense sooner based off of the fluid amounts on the ground level. And you can see that present in the preview here. You can see just how much it's breaking that up after a bit. Let's go to the turbulence tab. This is where things get really fun. Turbulence intensity, it's also got a density map that's very similar to this. Again, the defaults would have been like so. Just a reminder, you can actually do multiple undos in this F-curve editor, even after you close it down. You can make changes to it, then open it back up and hit Control Z, and it'll still remember the motion or move that you did to any of the points on the editor. Some settings here that really are not necessarily out of whack, just largest and smallest noise size. just to help give it that wonderful poofy cloud look once the rocket starts igniting. And we've got a significant amount of turbulent speed, though. This basically ensures that the fluid is churning over very, very quickly based off of these turbulence inputs. The intensity for this is 1.25 meters. This could be anything depending on the scale of your scene. But again, you have to make this work for visual reasons, not necessarily math reasons, based off of how much container volume space you've got to work with. Temperature. The rocket plume actually cools off very, very quickly in this. Normally the default for something like this is 2. We're cooling this off for a good reason, is that we don't want a lot of flame coming out of the bottom of the rocket and then spilling out into the platform here. So that's why it's cooling off very quickly. And we've got buoyancy. This is normally 20 centimeters. It's been jacked up to 30 centimeters and same buoyancy direction. Density channel. Dissipation for the density channel, which is our smoke shader. Once we get into the shading side, it's kicking out about 8%. It's going to hold in there for a good amount of time, but it's going to dissipate rather quickly. Gravity, very nominal settings, nothing scary, just enough to give it some more life and to ensure that it's pulling down away from the rocket as it takes off, and it's not just going to sit there and hang in the middle of the air once the rocket passes by. Okay, let's take a look at the shader tab here. This is where things get interesting. I'm going to switch our viewport look so that we're not looking at the density shader. We're looking at the fire shader. This will make a lot more sense. Let's go back over the rendering tab. Let's take a look at this F curve here, or function curve, it's known. And the goal with this curve was to provide a very hot kind of center and have it die off into yellow and oranges rather quickly, but in a very kind of controlled manner. Let's look at what happens here when I start moving this F curve around. You can see the changes to the amount of yellow and orange that's being picked up of the lower portion, while the top still kind of remains as if there's a white center to it, which is what we want. We want a hot white, oxygen, hydrogen mix or something of that nature. Solid rocket fuel will be different. We can get a really, really good, nice look out of this. And we know that it's going to go into that yellow curve area, but it's going to fall off really nicely afterwards. And the reason why, again, that we had that cooling take place so quickly in the simulation is because we didn't want any more of that fire coming out of here. We just wanted it to be really, really gentle. But if you have a little bit much that's too excessive, you can use this curve. I wanted it to be pretty fat at the bottom because it looked the best, in my opinion, at the time. And giving it just a little bit like this and having those little bits pop out, little flames, was great. Okay, I'm going to just even that out a little bit. You can see the changes there. Very subtle, but that's where we get that white hit. As you can see where this line lines up, that's the very top. Really what makes this work, though, is the color opacity settings. And it's a combination of the low and high temp being limited by a white point of 1, a dampening of 3, with the color for the actual flame being changed. Normally this is all 100% for each. This wasn't bad, but I felt it was a little bit too orangey, so I went down to 60 and it felt a lot better. And you can see just how different it looks just by dragging those high and low temperatures across. So we want a high temperature, but we don't want to spend too much time in that white. So around about 100 or 2100 in low temperature. You can drag that back, or you can crank it up. And you can see the shift in the values. So we'll go back to the defaults there because that's kind of where I wanted it. The dampening is a very, very handy tool. If you want to be just globally controlled for dampening, you can effectively dial that in manually. I found that this particular shot was 3, and the white point just left at default. You can change this, of course, and animate these over time. That's what these E's are for envelopes. And in some cases, I've done this and it works beautifully because having that animation change over time for a rocket, like it'll be really, really hot and intense. And then once it gets going, a lot of this will actually cool down depending on how it's being set up or what it's doing or what type of rocket it is. These things can really, really help. Subgrid detail for this. Noise intensity, not very high, but because the container is actually using voxels of under 5 centimeters, this is kind of intense. But we need that intensity to help break it up so that when it appears with the render over smoke, it looks like those flames are licking outside of the smoke shader, and it's giving us the effect that we want. This is slightly offset for the smoke shader in terms of the noise speed. Originally, when I set this up, this was closer to 5, and this was 6. I just changed it so it was a little bit slower. Nothing out of control here, just slightly different values. 2 centimeters, 4 centimeters, because I want a lot of chew in the flames. Let's take a look at what this looks like. And this is not going to take very long to render. This is actually very, very minimal. You got the container doing the multi-scattering, which is the internal radiosity, so to speak, of the shader system for turbulence FD, which provides light scattering inside the cloud. You can see here that we've got the nice breakup in chunks inside the plume, and we've got a very, very hot yellowish value for the base of the rocket where the main exhaust is being ignited, and then it cools off and then it turns into mostly smoke. But a lot of what's giving us this look is actually the fire noise intensity being the values that it are mixing with the smoke shader and the volume container fluid inputs to give us that breakup all over the place. So we could drop this down a little bit, 70 centimeters for the noise intensity on the smoke, and you'll see the shift in the look of the plume, not only just in the smoky areas, but also how that impacts the temperature channel, i.e. the fire. Let's take a look at these two. So very, very subtle shift, and it's mostly going to be noticed in here. Let's do one a little bit closer to the ground. Let's back up. There we go. You see those little sparkly bits? That's what I wanted with those particles bouncing off the ground. So let's drop this to 70. And let's increase the largest noise to, let's double that. See what we get. Very quick to process. Looks pretty cool. Got really nice breakup in the shader. Granted, this is very low resolution, just so I can pump this out very quickly so you can see it. But the smoke around it is very convincing. We've got nice color tone in the plume of the rocket. Let's go up a little bit higher here so we can see what things are doing further on in animation. Okay. So I've still got my white elements in here, and if I took this into the compositing program, I could do a little bit of color correction, a little bit of soft glow on it. It would work just brilliantly. A little bit of desaturation possibly, just to help it live a little bit. And keep in mind, this is extremely low resolution. This is only 960 by 540, these renders. And I do have a little bit of motion blur on here just to help it out a little bit, but it looks a little chunky on the sides, and obviously this rocket is a little bit sparkly because I adapted this from a very old scene, and it's not prepped for use in Lightwave 2024 yet. But the point of all of this is that we've got something that works as a rocket launch, and we have a plume that works beautifully. Let's just do a quick preview of just the fire so we can see how this fast cooling and the bounce of those particles gives us like a little spark trail. We've got that nice hot white center like you would see on most rockets. And the motion is all nice and contained. And a lovely looking plume. And this is great for shots that are really close to like a launch pad or off a missile launcher or something like that, versus trying to do long missile trails, which is something I would recommend people still use hypervoxels for because that's what it's really, really good at. And then for the close-ups, you could use TFD. And if you spend some time massaging things a little bit, you can get them to look seamless between shot to shot. So it looks pretty good. Let's take another look at this from a slightly different angle. Let's create a new camera. Call it cat cam. Let's go take a look through that and then move it off to the side. Let's get rid of this window for a second. And for this, I'm just going to want to track this missile. So I'm going to just have the whole thing look at the main body of the missile. And this should do its thing. And if you do sound effects at the same time with your mouth, it will totally sell the shot. Just kidding. The next step to this, of course, would be to up our settings, properly set up our motion blur. Let's take a look at what kind of settings those would be. Kind of production level settings. Again, I would probably render the plume and everything else separate from the rocket for geometry, and then render the actual volumetric effect itself off to the side. But let's take a look at what the effect settings are that we would use for a camera for, say, a show on the asylum. This is an actual real world production set of values. We don't want to go overboard here. This is okay to leave pretty much default. I could probably get away with putting the threshold a little bit higher in there. Let's take a look at the scene. Let's go to the render window. Take a look at what we got here. Reflection samples, probably increase that to 4. Don't really need to change anything else. This just helps clean up that surface of that missile, although I can go in and fix that at the surface level. Don't really need to change anything else. Lights that are in the scene. This is one other thing that I want to touch on. If you need to, let's go back to the other camera. For example, in this shot, we've got this plume, and fire generally doesn't cast shadow. Like, it's not something to cast shadow. What you're seeing, if you see fire in a shadow, you're seeing the distortions of light wavelengths going through heat. And if you need to control that for any reason, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. And we'll go back to the turbulence FD container here for a second. So let's go to the container. We're going to go to the mapping, and we've got a density channel in here that's controlling the opacity. We also have in the color and opacity tab an opacity value. We could set this to 5, so it's got some opacity to it. And what I'm going to do just for the moment, I'm going to turn off the smoke shader here. And we're just going to engage VPR because it won't need to do any calculations on the smoke. Now you can see that there's a little bit of shadowing in here. And this is just the opacity working with this mapping control. Let's turn it off for a second. You can see exactly what I'm talking about. Wait for it to refresh. You can see that it's got this really nice hard shadow now. This isn't entirely accurate. You really shouldn't be able to see Firecast's shadow. Of course, this has got its own opacity value that we are overriding with. So that would be not usable because we're not seeing the fire at all. But even with a low value of opacity 1, you can still see like light having passed through and cast some form of distortion, resulting in kind of a shadow look on the surface, but you can control it so it's not super hard black. Let's go and re-engage that opacity channel. And we can see that changing this mapping curve, or the F curve for it, will give us a very different look. And obviously this will impact other areas of the fire coming off. So use this sparingly, but these types of inputs, these types of values, those two between the color and opacity, and then the mapping for it, will help you control that effect. Let's undo that curve. Control Z. Poof, poof. Let's re-engage the smoke shader. Illumination doesn't need to be super accurate for this. It worked really well the first time out. If you need a little bit more thickness, crank that up a little bit. And we can, of course, change the base color of this, or we can even control that smoke with a gradient. Let's make this a little darker. Pull that value down. Most rocket launches that are using chemicals that are combining to produce an oxygen, hydrogen, or other mix will be quite white and bright. But depending on nature of your shot, you might want to darken things up a little bit, especially if you're pumping a lot of light into your shot. Now this render is going to be going with our camera. So it's not the view that we had looking at just a moment ago. But you can see it still renders very quickly and it cleans up very, very fast. Let's go to 100% here. There's a lot of nice breakup in there. The missile's now clean because I've thrown a few more reflection samples at it, plus the anti-aliasing, and you can see that the plume blurs. Now I could take this into a compositing program, make a couple of color correction changes, add some glow, and poof, that would be the end of the shot. It really wouldn't take long for that to render. Let's switch back to the other camera view here, and we'll scrub down the animation. Let's see what this looks like. Very fast for that container to solve the lighting on this. Granted, there is only one light currently active in the scene, but it works. Let's clean up, and it'll be done rendered. As with any renderer, more stuff that's on the screen that's more computationally intense to solve, it's going to take longer to render. But when you balance things out over the course of an animation and you've got stuff that's going into the sky like this, you're going to get a major speed boost along with your rocket as it travels, as it follows the camera, or a camera follows the rocket away from the surface. So we're not doing all this anti-aliasing through a volumetric effect, that sort of thing. but it's clean. This is a totally acceptable render time in production, and this is what we render most of our shots through on Asylum, and then we blow them up to 4K. If we can afford the time, we'll turn everything up and just let it rip and come back the next morning, or if we've got to rent a farm, come back in an hour. It all comes down to those types of things, but you can see how nicely this is working for having those little sparks come off there. A little bit of a color change I might do if I want to do it in the F-curve editor or in the dampening. Let's go back to the containers. Again, this is what this OpenGL view is so good for, because you can make these changes really quick and get pretty much where you want to go. Let's take that dampening, more hot, more cold. Just think of that like a compressor. Make it a little bit more red. Way brighter. Let's pull that hot amount down a little bit. Let's turn that minimum amount up. Let's go down the animation a little bit. Woohoo! And take another render. All kinds of things that you can do, but it is a little bit of a balancing act. Get things working out. As I mentioned before, almost all of these parameters are animatable. So if you want to start out very, very bright white and then go to red, you can. That's why those envelope functions are there.